Hello everyone, today we comment on a comment, in fact, that however will not make this question and answer video, though, for the reasons that I'm going to explain. I'm not going to even allow this comment, even though I don't have anything against it. I mean, it's an interesting question posed, and I will simply read it out loud, so you see that I'm not hiding anything, and I will base the entire video on it, but I will explain you also why I will not allow it, albeit I'm highlighting it with this video rather, and so if you want to get the comment, you have to get what comes on Schwerpunkt with it, and this aspect is very important because it explains you also a bit how the channel works and what its function is supposed to be, also for anyone really who wants to ask something. I rarely get questions in the first place, aside from requests and or not even concerning the historical content, like, you know, can you make this more than 480p because I can't watch it on television. Well, yeah, I mean, no, actually I can't because that takes too much time to upload and all, maybe in the future at some point, but it's not even so simple. I have a very strict schedule, and even the upload, the elaboration times rather, are say designed on it as well. But this question is actually a very historical, if not properly historiographical one, and that's why I think it's important to illustrate it. And I'm partly going to answer the question, but also expanding on it, of course. And the question goes simply like this, like say, first, this comment was, and you have to understand that, under a video I made on the Longobards last year that is titled the Longobard invasion of Italy, if I'm not wrong, the myth of the Nefandissima gens, that we will explain in a while, and that essentially discusses in that specific video, but I made many others on the Longobards, so the author of the question may also take note, and I'm going to address anything of the question itself, with the fact the Longobard settlement in Italy and the foundation of the Longobard kingdom. And that was somewhat successful video because people liked it and got lots of views and so on, and people are often interested in the Longobards, and it's actually from, I think, last spring that I don't make a video about them, so we will probably come back on them at some point. And so I was illustrating the say the historiographical background, a bit of the Longobard history, and making people aware of the fact that, of course, from roughly 70 years or even more, historiographically we have completely abandoned the myth fact of the Longobards as the terrible barbaric destroyers and so on, for reasons that are not the fact that, yeah, I mean, at large Germanic peoples were definitely not particularly, you know, gentle-hearted or, you know, civilized in many ways, but understanding in this sense the measure of that and what actually the Longobards and basically any other Germanic people who settled in the former regions of the Roman Empire achieved eventually in the history, in fact, not just of Western, but of world civilization as a consequence, and realizing why that happened. And this is something I can't explain entirely in this video because, first of all, I made so many on the Longobards and the migration era in general that my advice, and this is why this comment is useful for many reasons, you have to realize that even if you subscribed recently and you subscribed to Schwerpunkt besides other 600 channels, and you followed me so randomly, as you know, the notifications get, and you know you're interested in, and you don't know how much stuff I uploaded and why, and how the content is structured, well, it's quite unlikely that I will also take in consideration questions that will not have essentially checked already the topic of the same question, in fact, and among my content, checking whether there is something, in fact, that I already made about it. This is not necessarily the case. I mean, this is actually the case. I could simply say, well, you could go check kind of my other Longobard history or simply migration era videos, because the question is, as we'll see now, pretty wide. But it's also interesting and worthy of addressing the broader historiographical problem that is posed, because it says under this video, first reading the book from Norman F. Cantor and now listening to this video, I don't know what to believe. Cantor basically describes the Longobards, how you said, they are portrayed by the quote-unquote mainstream media. First of all, I never use the term mainstream media because that means that, too many bad things to consider. First of all, mainstream does not exist, because I don't know in which reality people live to think that there is things like mainstream or single thought. I mean, that just tells you that you oversimplify radically an extremely complex reality is literally as such under your eyes, and so if anything, you're going to be the easiest target of that kind of narrative. And which media? I give you that the term media is pretty wide, but normally when we say the media, we're talking about something that doesn't even address the Longobards. I don't know if you've noticed, like most of the topics I cover here is things that you normally don't just hear in pop culture, in the way at least I present. And yes, it's true, also in this sense of content, but definitely there's no such thing like the mainstream media. I appreciate the quote-unquote, of course, but the media that is not in quote-unquote, I don't get it. But, the Longobards are portrayed as, in fact, I continue with the question, barbaric, uneducated, etc. Speaking of Cantor, this historian passed in the early 2000s, so I will address this aspect as well, saying he was quite popular, right? He mentions how they weren't, I'm reading the question, the Longobards weren't so close in the Roman sphere of influence like the Goths, and that they didn't know Latin. Particularly, he mentions their first code of law, which he said was written in broken Latin, and was much more concerned with the regulation of their Germanic customs than the ruling and functioning of the state, right? Only for the statement, if I didn't check whether Cantor said anything of this, right? But you can't rest assured that if Cantor wrote any of this, well, I don't think you could even consider him as any historian in the first place. And this is one of the best proofs of the fact that you can have a PhD, but being one of the single most radically undereducated people that can exist out there, right? So if you're a medievalist, you keep up with certain academic standards, right? Being a person who reads the Edictum, Rotary, and after has been overwhelmingly studied in source and reference in a pretty huge amount of world historiography, especially in continental Europe, but very high levels and studied forever. I had the privilege of working also with people that were experts in the Edictum specifically. Like, it means that you literally have no idea. I'm talking about Cantor. You literally have no idea of what medieval history is, how it's done, and what historiography really is, which is quite fascinating, because Cantor is a person that, as we will see, got very popular because he wrote books essentially criticizing other medievalists, right? Which is pretty and sadly ironic, or unironic, in fact. Then the question goes on and says, in another book about monasticism, forgot the name right now, it said that they, the Longobards here, of course, destroyed/dispersed the early Benedictine monasteries, in brackets, although they later funded the creation of new ones. So this is the question. So there are so many wrong things with not with the question in itself. Like, that I'm here to answer any of your questions. I rarely get any, as I was saying before. So even when there are such, let's say, if I had 200 questions and the average were like this one, and just the word top 10 to make, probably would just have time to make a video response to just one. So if the channel grows and people keep asking questions, I will not be able to answer all of them. Sometimes I skip them also because they are mostly they're requests, really, or not questions. Like, can you make a video on this topic, and they don't articulate like what they want to know, why they want to know that, and so on. Right? They're just curious, and that's legitimate too. In fact, I already made videos on, let's say, on demand, but of course it's just based on whether I deem it to be, important enough or useful enough for the channel, for the audience, or for the same person, right? I consider myself stern but fair. I don't aggress people. I always try to, leave benefit for doubt. But at the same time, I love to analyze how people think history. How people, which is interestingly connected even with Cantor's work, right? So that's why I don't want to depict Cantor here as a villain, as a scumbag, as a bad person. First of all, because I didn't of course I didn't know him, but let's say I was too young, but I also frankly don't know his work well, right? I just have an idea of what he wrote and how, and what the criticism was about his method, about his prose, his lack of research, right? So the general impression is that this was a pretty sloppy historian who essentially lived out of ranting in the typical kind of this is not even the boomers generation or maybe can't fit like in the broader moral temper, but it's like saying again, yeah, I come from the Anglosphere. I have a PhD. I worked here and there in good institutions, and so I can afford to write whatever I want without publishers even complaining about what it's literally written in it, because I sold, I don't know, best-selling books because they're written in kind of low-key, low-register, popular language that every moron understands, and so I owe people essentially with no education that can, however, maybe yes, in this sense, approach to the Middle Ages thanks to my books in general, but also delivering a lot of bullshit in them, and in too many ways, right? Cantor, as far as I had the idea of him designed here, is let's say was a person who, the typical, I would say, introvert who can get very touchy about feeling criticized and has to launch trails at other scholars in criticizing the system and so on, in many ways, in a broader way, right? Maybe he also productively so, right? As far as I understand, the best of his work was this provocative consideration of several authors, also different ages, not just, but also the contemporary scholarship, and saying, this guy was important for this and that. It's something that you don't really find so often outside of normally the school of certain specific, say, among the pupils of certain specific professors, and I wouldn't be surprised in a sense that there was also a bit of clash of interests behind this, not necessarily venial ones, but cultural in a broader sense. For example, Cantor is very Anglo-Americanly, based, right? And this is as you know, I also worked a lot on the Anglosphere historiographical production. I think it every day, but let's say in the way it was declined with Cantor is kind of the idea. Basically, only I exist because in the second half of the 20th century, I attended these universities. I taught in these universities. I published a lot of stuff, and people bought it, and so I'm special, and so there is nothing better than me that ever existed and that is out there. In fact, what was being criticized, so from a strictly continuistic point of view, about his work is that he never really ventured in, say, much of the rest of continental, southern, eastern, or even Celtic Europe, right? His entire point is kind of what he's specialized in. I think he had a PhD in something like, say, English monastic, or English ecclesiastical history or something like that. And he was criticized because he remained just confined in that, like the early Middle Ages, so including the Longobards, the late Middle Ages, even though he wrote about the latter two, he wrote about the plague, and the end, a bit like Yudzinga's, sunset of the Middle Ages, deal with that. But let's say the idea from also the reviews, from the even probably from the prose he used and the way he expressed himself, it makes him absolutely unqualified to talk about them. That is to say, if I know possibly even high school students or bachelor history students that are more competent than Cantor in writing about certain specific issues, right? So I think I'm so intrigued with this question, if anything, because it allows me to touch on this reality that, you see, this user read, it's an interesting story behind him. He read Cantor's book. He watched my video. I don't know whether there is a connection between them, because Cantor, I don't think he wrote specifically about the Longobards. He surely wrote about them, given that he covered very generalistically a bit the entire idea of the Western Middle Ages, so the macro historical issues between, I don't know, the Franks, the Longobards, the Papacy, surely those were touched. But in ways that, unfortunately, I know too well, and that existed historiographically, they still exist, right? Of, again, scholars that do not have any specific expertise in the topic they discuss, but they don't even try to make up for that deficiency, right? Just to make an example, I wrote an article recently about at least mostly about a battle that was written, that inspired several books, and none of these works actually analyzed the tactics of this battle. Nobody sit there and said, okay, we have this and that source, let's try to reconstruct the battle, how it went. Nobody did it. And so they all began, I know even of people that knew a lot, much more than me, in notionistically speaking, in terms of sources and so on, but that wrote maybe a 300 pages book on this battle, and did not make the homework of properly picking the single source and saying how likely is it, what they say altogether, what's the complication in interpretation of the battle, whatever. No, they simply skipped it, right? And those even wrote good history books. Cantor is just like, again, the average 20th century, say second half of the 20th century, again, I know it all, even though I don't know shit, kind of historian that found, probably in a clever way, the way of being famous and making money by writing that kind of cheaper content for less educated people, for gullible people that say, oh wow, this guy's a PhD whatever professor, he wrote so much, he's so famous, everybody reads him, so he must be reliable, right? And so this guy, I presume, I don't know, maybe it's a girl who came to comment on my video, simply says, I've read this guy, and then I listened to you, and so I'm fascinated with the comparison, like how people, probably young people, I'm not sure about this, but often young people that are younger than me, literally seek for answers properly from authorities, but they don't often realize who's the authority, and they can't distinguish that, right? So of course, if I tell you something about the Longobards, I wrote just a very humble 160 pages bachelor thesis on Longobard military history from Scandinavia to the end of the kingdom, and that's it, right? So I eventually didn't work on Longobards more than much. I just remain in touch with experts on this topic and so on, and I know a thing or two about even certain rather specific things. I, for example, worked on the edictum that here Cantor discusses, and I can tell you as a PhD myself that this person literally doesn't know what medieval sources are. If the actual take on the edictum was that, because this is not, I'm talking about Cantor still, of course, not the author of the question. Again, I have nothing against the author of the question. On the contrary, I have a huge sympathy towards him. But I literally mean, this is not just not knowing how to read an early medieval source. This is literally not, and this is the worst of it all, right? That this was, again, a professor, a very worldly one, at least in terms of reach, with his works, that died, I think, in 2004, 2007, I don't remember when. And so that had all the time, like most of his life, literally when he was getting his PhD, works on the Longobards were already at very high level to read and learn. That literally, that is not a thing, that you can't even become a PhD today in a university if you express this claim on the edictum of Rotary. But that especially should have known better. I mean, what do you do? Do you write just because you think that you personally know things without checking scholarship? And you know that personally I am much more wired to sources. Like, scholarship to me comes later, but again, when you speak to a broader audience and also with some kind of aura of credibility, you must know every single damn thing that has been written on anything that you write, right? And so the problem being exactly this, that of course, in order to sell such books where eventually people read bullshit from, you don't have even to to do anything. You essentially just write at whatever you feel like with your fantasy, that you cannot avoid eventually people criticizing you. Again, Cantor's dead recently, so probably his family's attached. I've seen there are articles online talking, our dear professor, all these kind of things. But I mean, let's be honest. Like, this is exactly what you want to avoid when you are alive, right? That when you're dead, people look back at you and say, this guy was a moron, right? And we have to be completely honest about this, because such statements cannot afford to be allowed, right? If there were something like kind of a ban on freedom of speech, like objectively stating certain things in the position from which you are about a major historical source that eventually also essentially triggered the revival of Roman law. But of course, Cantor doesn't give a shit about Roman law, because in the Anglosphere he says that common law is the best thing that ever happened, and that, allegedly, as I've seen, he even claims that, Roman law threatened that at that point, while basically a few people know that actually Roman law was kind of common law, especially in the beginning, and actually was in the beginning, and much of the principles remain the same, but that Europe didn't have really that struggle, and that Roman law at some point was actually sought after by the same Longobardists that were the most advanced jurists of the High Middle Ages, by the way, the same age which Cantor should have been allegedly an expert on, and that carry out the greatest achievements in the history of medieval law, and consequently also for most of the modern age to come. And I made plenty of videos about history of law. I don't think I ever made a video about the edictum Rotary, but I will say something about this, because of course how the concept is presented is just an abomination, and let's say it honest. Like, again, in front of the entire historiography existing on the topic, on the Longobards, on medieval law. This is not a personal opinion. Personal opinions are important only in the measure in which they affect reality, and not for themselves. Like, we have to erase from people's minds that just having an opinion has anything to do with it having any dignity of worth. And opinions that have a greater impact in reality are the ones that eventually work, because they're not just explosive shells like this bullshit that Cantor wrote that can confuse people, because the entire historiographical branch, on the subject matter in Europe, in North America, all over the Western world and beyond, today does not allow, and for very granitic, sound, macroscopically demonstrated reasons, that this is not a point. That it's just, wishful thinking gibberish of, some kind of leftover regurgitation of ethno-nationalist 19th century propaganda without any philological or literary or historical linguistical, competence compared to the one that was built afterwards. It's just not because it's ethno-nationalistic. You know that I am a conservative. Cantor was a conservative as well. But this reminds me how last winter I made a video that is titled exactly, being conservative doesn't spare you from cultural underdevelopment, and this is exactly what we're talking about. You are responsible for what you say and what you do. And in the moment in which you do this, you stop having any right regarding anything that you want to take back from it, because you altered reality and there's no way the thing is gonna come back the same. So if you screw it up, other people have to blast you, right? So I'm sorry about that. And of course there are ways and ways of doing this. Probably if I had spoken with Cantor, I may have, about this, let's say, I would have found kind of a more articulate way of putting the matter. So I expect that the author of the question here just somehow added a little bit of his own, maybe kind of contrast to the idea. Because, by the way, in my video, it's not that I'm presenting the Longobards, again, especially at the beginning of their settlement in Italy, as, a civilized people. Like, this is the other problem. Civilization is something complex. The Longobards weren't, a bunch of wild animals at all, right? And it seems, unfortunately, what historiography like to depict in part some peoples in history, and then it came back on its feet and began to say, no, these people were actual geniuses, there are no cultural differences, everybody has their own, there is no better or worse, which is the opposite leftistic, multiculturalist bullshit, also that is not true. So if you want to learn history well, you have to have a pretty solid and massive idea of the hierarchy of civilizational value, worth, morality, and culture, right? There is no such thing like one people that is equal to another, for better and for worse, right? There is only one truth, and in relation to it, every single person on earth, first of all, is different from any other, and not only, but is better or worse compared to that reality. And there is no way around it, right? So appreciating, of course, the accomplishments of Romano-Germanic kingdoms doesn't mean to say, okay, what are the standards that you're setting here, right? What is exactly in my video that makes you presume that, let's say, what I'm saying is diametrically opposite, for example, to what Cantor is saying, which I don't even know because I haven't read exactly what he wrote, but I read what you are writing and the way you're trying to distinguish the two things. Of course, the author of the question understands that there is a subtlety here, but the attitude seems one of despair, because it says, first reading Cantor and then listening to your video, now I don't know what to believe. And the question is, it's not that you have to believe, right? I'm impressed when I see, especially in other videos, people that get pissed. This is not the case. sometimes, for example, there is one I made in Byzantine history, the point of the Romans, etc., how people approach the question. That I discovered, I didn't know this, that people are generally angry with the fact that someone lied to them, according to them, allegedly lied to them about history. In the sense that, of course, history could be always told better and so on. But aside from any of those people's responsibilities may even exist and do exist all the time, and definitely Cantor is an example of this. The question is, why did you actually pose yourself in the moral position of believing passively what other people told you? I understand as a child, maybe you can't understand certain things. They get in you, they remain ingrained as a cognitive structure. All these things, there is a bias involved. But I think the question is much more complex than that, because I don't know where people will say that lived, right? But even though, and I often talk about this, we do live in an incompetent world, broadly meant, I think we always had the chance to choose what to actually learn, to how to, and so on. And so I really think that this attitude, as we have been lied, there is a history we've not been told, doesn't come from the superstitiously passive, chthonic, vulgar, populistic mentality that essentially makes people slaves to themselves and victims of imaginary enemies, while the entire traditional point is that you should be ruling over the world in virtue of your own knowledge and power and right to rule. And history is like this, right? Nobody can, at least, not living in a dictatorship, fortunately, and so on. You can learn history on your own. And so, if you came to learn something wrong, that is kind of your fault at the end of the day. Like, even if you lived in a totalitarianism, still the condition in which you are doesn't make you less responsible. On the contrary, as a human being. So this attitude is important. You don't have to believe people, right? I understand that YouTube videos very often cannot be like, here there is the source and this other, because in order to make a broader audience, like maybe also how Cantor was looking at the thing, like, you have to speak in more digestible ways, right? But it's literally a matter of method. If I, for example, were to analyze all the sources that require to have an expert knowledge, so not even an absolute or a perfect one, but literally what we know at this point in history about the topic, I, first of all, couldn't make YouTube videos and talk to people. But secondly, I would also, if I were to present this content in the same YouTube videos, I wouldn't be watched by anyone, because yes, people can be interested in the source, maybe if you present it in a certain way, but generally speaking, it narrows the things down to things that in general people do not in fact have any even interest in listening, which is perhaps also the reason why my channel is not so watched, even though I objectively, but I don't say it to flatter myself, because I make more in-depth content. It's just that, in fact, more intelligent channels are designed on, at least as they're more interested probably in income, in getting views rather than trying to make some points that may be useful for those who get them. I'm betting, but I'm making kind of I'm compromising as well between the two things, because, and not because of the income, but as how in depth should I go with these videos? Like, even for making the other day video about the Battle of Poitiers and reading a bit of the sources and the historiography, it took a lot, right? And I make videos every day, and there are some things I know, and I am followed. People, generally speaking, subscribe when they learn that I exist and so on. So it's not so bad, right? But in a video like the one on the Longobard settlements in Italy and so on, of course, I couldn't literally explain the entire historiographical matter, how and why the Longobards were conceived as essentially barbarian destroyers, and why we discovered that it wasn't kind of the case, and that in many ways the Longobard kingdom, not just by the end of the 7th century, with especially the disgregation of the Merovingian one, was the largest power in Western Europe, at least in Latin-Germanic Europe, but also was dramatically more civilly advanced, of course, than anything that existed north of the Alps. This is, again, pretty sound. I mean, if you study Wickham, Capo, Arnaldi, there are so many authors that, scope Longobard history far and wide, but not to the point of, I don't know how to judge them, because here I'm told they destroyed a monastery. That would be Monte Cassino, by the way, so not exactly one monastery like another that you would forget along the way. But there is a very specific context there, and the basics of that history is known since the modern age. Like, it's not that we have to wonder about it today. Once I remember, I got lots of questions on the Longobards, but just to make you understand the attitude, there are many people who also make me questions because, like, they are Americans of specific European nationalities, descent. And very often you can see it because they have names like, I don't know, it's Fuchs, and they ask me things about Germany, but I see they are medieval Germany, but they are Americans. I get Italian American names in the profiles, ask me about I don't know, the Kingdom of Naples and all these kind of things. So I obviously understand there what's bracket. I know it's a professional bias. I realize these kind of things. And I remember one question about the Longobards, and there's a bit of this idea of mystery of the Middle Ages that we have to dig into the sources, that is as if history was more a legend than an actual scientific thing. And asking about the boundaries of certain specific Longobard duchies. And this guy said, do you know exactly? I don't remember even what he was asking specifically about that, but let's say he said, I spoke with one, I don't know, it was a touring guide or a person leaving, let's say, I think it was in the north of Italy. He was connected specifically to the Longobards and said that this kind of localistic perspective, like, that the boundary of the duchy was like beyond that river, beyond that. No, it actually was a much bigger mistake, like saying, I don't know, the Longobards stopped just to the Po Valley. Right? So we are at these levels of complete historical ignorance, and trying to fabricate in their own minds, this was something that they needed the information of the locals today in 2022 to know in order to understand, let's say, the broader, say the highlights on Longobard history. I don't know how to say that, but, historiography, at this point in history, it's to a scale of advancement that, in fact, proves that the average person doesn't even understand it exists. Like, it's so big and somewhat over-encompassing that, of course, we know perfectly well what were the, say, in this case, the boundaries of the Longobard kingdom on a regional scale, like the entire peninsula, for example. And it's not that we need to ask locals to know these kind of things. So equally, this question presents us with the same way. Like, there is a genericistic Canadian historian that writes gossip about something that he probably read only once in his life on a manual, and then in my case, this again, a PhD that makes videos on YouTube and that has some degree of advancement in the specific history of the Longobards. Right? I surely don't know much about Cantor's PhD, for example. So we all have our own, right? And if I were to, to talk about, as I do, for example, about ecclesiastical history and so on, I document myself on updated historiography that I can also recognize as such and not making up things in mind. Again, Cantor lived in a very different time when historians were allowed even to do, in a sense, this kind of things, right? For reasons that I can't explain now historically because it would take too long, but I think Cantor got his doctorate in 1951 or something like that. So completely different world, and it's difficult for today's person to read a work like that and, let's say, interpreting it within this chronological order, right? This is very interesting because there are lots of backs and forths also in historiography in terms of interests of let's say, specific attitudes towards it that have to do with how the broader audience also approaches it, right? So may seem banal, but 20 years ago we had 20 years less of historiography, and everything was much simpler for every historian. And things are not going to get simpler; they're going to get more complex, and so more difficult to understand overall, right? So first, this attitude: do not believe in, right? Do not take history for some sort of messianic, patheticistic endeavor where there are, some vatas that speak to you and you have to follow them because, oh my God, that is the scholar. Or Cantor is exactly, again, one of the best examples that you can't be a PhD, a professor, but literally not knowing what even medieval history concretely is. And I'm not exaggerating. Because you see, Cantor has been accused specifically of, this is perhaps the most important thing to answer the question, of that kind of bias towards the Dark Ages. This idea, oh, look at how the entire Middle Ages were barbaric and uneducated. This is not just what he thought about the Longobards, he thought it about the entire thing. He mocked medieval people. He is somehow, he loved the period. He worked essentially to show us how there is a cultural superimposition of perceptions throughout history of what the past has been, etc. But he seems to fall into the problem itself, right? So I don't think that Cantor necessarily had anything against Longobards, but that he seems to have been somewhat lost in that kind of obsession on how you picture the past, to the point that you don't even research it anymore, but you just get lost into this broader impression, right? And this is not just the only thing he does. For example, just banally, he's been accused of having used I think it was a nursery rhyme or something that is first documented for the early 18th century to describe essentially what was thought, like it's as if it was literally a medieval history. I think about the plague or something. But this is not important. The important being, like, you just take random stuff. You maybe write an entire paragraph about this thing without even caring about the history, the philology, the literature of it all. Like, it's a modern age thing. It may have still, yes, something medieval in the sense that, of course, the modern age was just civilization, a continuation of what we call the Middle Ages. Everything is complex, but you are literally dispatching it for a medieval source. Equally, this idea of, again, the Middle Ages being barbaric and backwards, it seems to be the entire setting on his take on the plague. He was very clumsy also from a linguistic point of view. I know, English is not my mother tongue, so I express myself poorly, but he wrote sometimes really banal and badly written things, really. Using, for example, there's a quote here I have. Read this. The aristocratic Frankish women with whom the lords and knights diurnally copulated in the highly ceilinged wooden feasting halls among the packs of dogs and heaped garbage bones of countless red meat roasted dinners, if only to save themselves from constant pregnancies and early deaths in the roulette experiences of perilous childbirths, had begun to urge their masters and sons to fabled and valiant deeds of heroic romance in distant exotic climes. Right? A person who writes like this definitely has a fervid imagination, has even an expressional capacity, but, this is just, you write historical fiction, you write novels, you don't pretend to be a historian, right? You don't pretend that this kind of approach to history has even methodologically any validity, because even if every single thing you wrote here had been true at some point, first of all, we don't know it with that true certainty, and secondly, the way we actually know where even your own thoughts about this come from the literature and so on, are here just squeezed, compressed together evidently for the purpose of creating kind of a tasty passage, an hyperbolic one, quite, even in the same English language, this period is too long, it's exaggerated, right? And so what Cantor was doing here surely was kind of giving an emotional punch to the way we look at things, but all the topics he addresses here are probably object of or will be at least quite sooner than we think, about an incredibly vast and controversial historiography that will squeeze their own brain to actually find out by which measure these things actually happened, by how much they've been idealized, or how much in fact they have been hidden, and so on. And that's what history is practically about. It's not just you making a character of these guys and telling history like a comic book. It may be interesting, again, for a person that has never heard of the Middle Ages in a historical sense. But if you use too often the term power tripping, for example, or you express yourself in terms like the origins of the modern state, we can, with justification, say was being born here. I think that you're doing, again, some kind of literary game here, not really a historical research, or even disclosure. You're rather saying, look at me, I say things funny, so read more. It may be a strategy, but historians and people who are interested in some kind of higher learning, including those who aspire to that without any specific competence on the Middle Ages, are not interested and may be misguided by this attitude, right? So it's not a good thing. But this is not even the worst things that Cantor really has done, and we'll talk about it in a while. But going back to the question, here he says, Cantor basically describes the Longobards how you said they are portrayed as mainstream media, as barbaric, uneducated, etc. So let's focus on these two adjectives specifically. Barbaric. What does barbaric mean? First of all, there is a difference between barbaric and barbarian, which mostly pertains to at least in its difference to what every person should use a language like. But unfortunately, people forgets the difference between barbarism, barbarity, and et similia. The concept of being barbaric is naturally relatable whenever we consider, again, a civilization that is less developed than another. In that sense, were the Longobards more developed than, say, the Byzantines at that time? Well, definitely no, right? But this doesn't mean that they weren't a force capable of positive accomplishment or change, right? The term label, by the way, and this opens a giant parenthesis that I shouldn't open. In fact, I will not. But the idea is that today people are too paranoid for the aforementioned reasons. That is to say, every single thing that they hear that they don't like, they have to basically pretend there is a huge conspiracy theory because the media are lying to them, and they know, and they, of course, they don't provide with any actual explanation of anything. They just throw things there that prove that they're not habituated to make a point, to organize properly a concept logically or rationally, and the point being, look, I feel that I am smart because I'm countering magic, invisible enemies, or at least I think that the world is so simple that I can't understand it individually. Without knowing anything about that and proving you with such statements. This is, so the term barbaric is, for some reason now in history, we have a problem that is especially a problem that I see in the West, Again, not because the rest of the world has anything to teach the West, contrary to what is believed. There are lots of people who are in self-hatred because they realize that, again, they are too inadequate to understand, and so they want to tear down the entire civilization to bring them at their same level. It's social envy. It's the same thing of communism, right? I'm poor, I'm stupid, I'm ignorant, so everybody has to be the same, not to hurt my feelings. Except others actually earned that, and if they didn't, by the way, they also fall to your same level sooner or later, because that's also what the second principle of thermodynamics really tells us, in a broader take. And so everything that is empires, states, civilization is demonized, right? The idea is that, I don't know, the Romans were the Nazis of the ancient world, and now that the Americans are the evil guys, and the NATO is trying to take over the world, and Russia is a hero that is fighting to defend European traditional values. I mean, these forms of cultural inferiority are the new disease of the world right now, right? They are essentially the same disease that makes Russia to be the one that is, China the one that is, India the one that is. Yes, I'm talking in a broader sense because I really believe that, the more I study history, and this is what I didn't know when I was younger and more stupid, that more or less everybody's kind of the same, right? And we just, as Westerners, think that we're better than the others because we're stupid, right? The more you study history, I can tell you that the more you understand why we are actually superior to other peoples and cultures. This may be, as a broader take, again, you say, what are you even saying this thing in this video? Because in order to make you understand that you cannot have a subjective opinion on reality and pretend it to make it work, and pretending that it's real. Because in order to have that opinion, you must demonstrate it, right? In order to demonstrate this proposition, I've made more than 1,500 videos that all basically mean the same thing, even though, again, the average person doesn't see that, because the average person maybe comes here thinking that since I even talk about the Middle Ages, I'm a conservative, I must, for example, buy in the shit that they believe, and so feel that they have a friend or something, and then they get hysterical and aggressive when they realize that maybe they have been following me for 1 year and have the diametrically opposite political ideas than them, that are incidentally much more brutally right-wing, but not definitely in an ethno-nationalist or racially superiorist direction, not even in a multicultural. It's something that I've never heard of, and that because of cognitive dissonance they cannot bear, and they cannot recognize, right? So we must stop pretending, again, that the average person is able to recognize or to have any meaningful opinion on such a complex thing like history is, right? You cannot go out there and say, I know the history of my own country. I myself don't. I realize that I don't because it's too big, right? Not even with my background, I can't afford to say something like that. What the average person will say, because they have to feel safe about themselves, is, I do, right? So the term barbarian, barbaric, is brutally misused, right? Very often, I know this is the most typical thing. There are racial supremacists who basically accuse certain past cultures that they do not consider white because, say, I don't know, maybe the Romans weren't as fair as the Norse, and saying, you see, the Romans were the evil Nazis of the past because they called us, by the way, as if they even cared about them, barbarians. And so we can't say that there were kind of people that were right to be slaughtered and then we triumphed on them and whatever. So if I use the term, I love the Longobards because I studied them, I love their history, they're exceptional, and I don't see any problem in calling them barbarian, because the term barbarian came about in a very specific context. For example, it was very differently used between by the Greeks and the Romans respectively. There was a deeper meaning anthropologically, historiographically, ethnographically, and so on, that even literary, that the average person who reads barbarians just sees an insult in that, or that is rightly or wrongly deserved, and go with that. This is the average approach to the side of a story. And it's terrifying, right? The same goes for uneducated. Were the Longobards uneducated? What do you mean by educated? What standards are we drawing here? Were they as educated as the Byzantines? Definitely not, right? Were they completely devoid of any form of education? Of course not. And of course, the way Cantor approaches that in that kind of sort of scholarly alleged superiority, as if, again, magically all the Enlightenment positivistic values attributed to Hellenic philosophy or scholarship or science were magically transplanted in the Anglo-American world with the same function 2 millennia afterwards, to say whatever we say, it's as if the school of Athens had said it back at the time, and therefore we are the educated ones, and who doesn't even know how to write a classical Latin must be a barbarian, is a pretty dumb idea. And you see how things have changed from Cantor's times, because in Cantor's times, again, the model of reference were the Romans, right? Here, the broader sense is that through the British Empire, through the US power, the new Roman Empire, the new greatness, the new civilization, a new state, a new reason, was, there in the West, in the present. In a few decades later, today, we think the opposite. Tribalism has taken over. The Roman Empire is not considered even a Western thing anymore, or at least it is, but in the sense of controversially, these were just the people who were sending the immigrants in and that destroyed European tradition because, I don't know, the persecuted the Druids, and everything has switched completely, again, on bases that have literally nothing to do with any historical interpretational capacity. And it's just a broader mood of the masses that react, and that is actually a pretty sad one, because it's not even going the way they're thinking they are, because at least the British Empire, the United States could claim, say, we are the next kind of universal empire in a sense, with all the problems this entails, of course, in this sort of tradition, doesn't matter. But they had there was a true traditional sense in that, meaning to be the superior ones, the ones that actually achieved that and that ruled over the world. That is something you have to be proud of. Today, even whiny, shitty white supremacists complain about things like colonialism, in a sense, because they say, everybody at their home. What is something so regressive, weak, and frankly anti-traditional, such as, entrenching yourself in a sort of safe space that you're phobic and paranoid, that dark forces from the outside can come to destroy, as opposed to the Apollonian heroic imperialism that is essentially the triumph of cultural, moral, and personal superiority over the universe as such. This is exactly what happens where the masses grow weaker, and so actually demolishing the entire point of the idea of any suprematism in that sense, because only for fearing, it means that you're culturally inferior. And this is what the entirety of the past, up to, again, the 19th century, 20th century, say, why the British Empire took over 1/4 of the world, why the Americans essentially controlled 2/3 of world forces after World War II, because they were culturally superior, because they really had the moral superiority to achieve that, and the others, whether they liked it or not, they didn't, right? Just like they don't have it today at large, because that's really where it still gets down to, and there are very specific historical reasons. So, and there are millennia long, you cannot change it in a generation, by the way. So, the entire point of this all is, what does it even mean to be uneducated in the 6th century, right? In the moment of greatest contraction, demographically, economically, in a terrible time where, of course, the people inhabiting the Barbaricum were illiterate. Of course, there were comparatively culturally underdeveloped. It's not the Germans created another empire that eventually ruled everything. It was an extremely, like, the Latin-Germanic structures took an awful lot of time to start. They eventually they didn't achieve a single empire, right? Even the Carolingian one lasted and happened just by accident, in a sense. And this is the broader crumbling of the world toward the abyss at the end of the day, that the Middle Ages have this powerful comeback, that also properly that original moral force that brought peoples like the Longobards, etc., to take over the impoverished masses of the Mediterranean, to make the latifundium system crumble, the empire to shrink. Still, however, in a broader sense, are not what you could call, could heroize too much, aside from their individual traditions that, of course, looked at those times in ways that at least they remember in a kind of heroic way, but they are definitely incomparable just with what, the same Romans had done. But the point here is dramatically important, because written culture definitely means a lot. I mean, written culture is the same one of sedentary peoples. It's the same one of states. It's the same ones of administration. Now, I don't have to digress on the philosophy of history that makes you realize what the early Middle Ages really were in this sense, but you know that there was a brutal contraction in that phase, and that this didn't really happen just because of, progress, let's say environmental cases, structural issues. This were there were surely systemic issues, but due to that kind of world aging and of kind of exhaustion that such moral force also brings from a material one, and that a civilization what wants to take the next step further has to make a dramatic effort that is against the laws of physics even, and that can advance, as we will see, as it happened during the modern age, the contemporary era, just mostly because of materialistic reasons. Technologies, as of course, being implanted among peoples that required some kind of force due to the broader fluctuations of their expansion, of their capacity of consolidating, also material bases, in fact, but that do not have to do with the individual superiority of the past, the moral force of the past, the intelligence of the past, the courage of the past. So while peoples like the Longobards, say on average, were embodying that, especially in a moral sense, to actually carry out a pretty important achievement, in this case in Italy, in the other essentially lands, the former Western Roman Empire, naturally on the base of the previous Roman achievements, because this is the actual point, right? What the Merovingians achieved in Gaul, what the Longobards achieved in Italy, what the Visigoths achieved in Spain, even what the Anglo-Saxons achieved in Britain, even though less than the others because it was a less Romanized area, still are, of course, way more significant than anything that happened, say, in Central Europe or in Eastern Europe or in Northern Europe. There is a very specific reason. Well, the Longobards, in this sense, do not get credit because most people stop studying them after their settlement. I think, even as I explained in the same video from which the author of the question drew his considerations on my point, that is, again, one of historiography today, of how the Longobards were, I expressed the fact that, again, the judgment on the Longobards comes mostly from either the very first moment of their settlement in Italy or the very years of their end. So living in between a good 150 years of dramatic accomplishments that people on average don't study because essentially they are stuck to the level of mental simplicity of tribalism and cannot distinguish the value of civilization and in what it quite concretely substantiates itself. And I'm talking specifically about this, in fact. On average, how many people know about, I don't know, the Longobards that conquer Italy and that everything went bad because the Byzantines had managed to reconquer Italy, and completely ignoring the fact that it was the Byzantines, actually, the Goths by carrying out scorched earth strategies, but the Byzantines in general for having mishandled dramatically that situation that destroyed Italy. And when the Longobards arrived, there was even not so much left to destroy in the first place, but first of all, a people that is going to settle in one place, I don't know how to tell it, but it doesn't destroy things, right? The same goes for, I don't know, the Vandals. They made a mess in Spain, but when they arrived in Africa, there is no evidence archaeologically of any kind of, like, what do you destroy? The same place where you have to rule? I mean, what actually resources cost in pre-industrial systems, and especially in those years. The same goes for the Franks in northern Gaul. The same goes in many ways, probably for even the Anglo-Saxons, aside from the fact that, in fact, the main change had occurred before the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain. I mean, the continuity with the Roman advancement, let's say, it's pretty evident in places like Burgundy, like in Spain, even in the same Italy, that, albeit sharing a bit with Britain, that kind of crack in between that was pretty bad, still was, for European standards, dramatically urbanized. I mean, the same largest cities of the Byzantine Empire were actually in Italy. They were not in the Aegean. This is, and for not talking about for literacy, for example, even in the so-called darkest centuries, that are the ones the Longobards rule in, even the same endemic concentration, per capita wealth. These are things that eventually make the Longobards that ruled over this population, also contending power from the Byzantines who wanted to reconquer, and the Italian population at large being sympathetic towards Longobards. Again, for all things I can't digress on, but I made so many videos on the Longobards that explain you in the specifics why I'm saying this. We're also attacked by the Franks and so on. The entire trick of this idea of the terrible Longobards is that in the 19th century, both, say, German, Italian scholars, when they analyzed sources of the Longobard Italy, they found everybody had more or less a Germanic name, and yeah, there was some Roman here and there, but they couldn't really understand where all the Romans had gone after the invasion. The point is that, as we realize today, everybody had essentially become a Longobard. By law, right, gradually through the generations, people had mixed, and you don't have even, this is valid for the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms. What's the point of maintaining kind of a strict juridical division regarding to ethnicity when, it's literally the same country, the same people, the same culture, the same society? Doesn't make any sense, especially when, again, you also live in a moment that is not exactly easy, where you can spend resources for useless things that do not happen in history anyway. And when the thing was also pretty damn successful, the entire history of the Longobards splitting in duchies, again, does not exist. Since Authority put an end to the so-called ducal anarchy and the kingdom was formed, until the very end of the kingdom, that is to say, when Desiderius buys his crown from the Franks, and somebody in Longobard northeast, that was so called as Austria, says, but this guy is not our king because he bought a crown from foreign invaders. There is no evidence, but not a single one, of any duchy in Longobard Italy saying, yes, we are autonomous, but in this sense we do not recognize the king in Pavia, or we are simply another thing and we don't want to be brought down. This is true even for the furthermost duchies. Grimoald, for example, came to be a king of the Longobards as Duke of Benevent. Also, the history of the Arians and the Catholics. that here allegedly maybe Cantor believed in. At least if it is really what he wrote about. Look at how terrible the Longobards were because they destroyed. He was surely referring to Monte Cassino, the first destruction of Monte Cassino, somewhere between the 70s and the 80s of the 6th century, and we can trace. Look, these were the terrible Arians that were actually not even Arians, they were still pagans, but they were using Arianism as a kind of, sort of, disguise. And this means that the Longobards kingdom was just a bunch of brutes. What about the fact that there is not a single evidence of destruction of any church or any monastery and as you would obviously understand, in Longobard territory, right? Monte Cassino was destroyed because that was Roman territory, and that there was a wandering war band during the ducal anarchy that said, just a bit like the Vikings did later, there's a fat rich monastery already at, after not even, say, half a century it was founded. They sacked it and they came back, right? That's how they, I don't know, at some point the same Agilulf that opened to Catholicism besieged Rome, because guess what? That was Rome, first of all, so it doesn't need presentations, but secondly was Byzantine territory, and it looted all around the countryside and sold, the locals as slaves in France to the Franks, to the Burgundians. So what? How is this a form of deep hatred against the Romans that made up the overwhelming majority of the Longobard kingdom population, and that kind of supported the entire thing that the Longobards were doing? How this has to do with any alleged persecution that is not seen, is not documented in any source in Longobard history. The thing that the Longobards did at worst against Catholics was that in the most important diocese of their own kingdom, they substituted at the beginning some bishops of their own to the previous ones, that most of which had actually fled. And when the Longobards moved in, and again, from archaeology, we don't have any evidence of any form, even of warfare, taking place. The entire history of Pavia, for example, being besieged for 3 years, is made up. It's made up on the base of Theodoric's siege of Ravenna at the time of Odoacer, so that the Longobards wanted to parallel themselves to the great Dietrich, and from Bern. That is the thing in the story from a much later account. So to show, look, the Longobards did a bit the same thing the Ostrogoths did. We know also that some Byzantine garrisons that held out in northern Italy, in some islands of the in the pre-Alpine lakes and so on, they simply remained there. Like the Longobards settled around, they remained in the island. They traded with the Longobards, and at a certain point, they stopped just even pretending they were Byzantines, and we don't even know bloodshed. This kind of things, right? Warfare was pretty harsh along the frontier, because the frontier from the other side had Byzantine forces that attacked the Longobards, who attacked the Byzantines. There was also a dramatic fight among the same Longobards, because actually, even though we don't have a direct source about that, it's quite likely that the Longobard migration into Italy was decided by the Byzantines. That is to say, they agreed to this settlement to create a buffer state to oppose to the Franks that were, I made a video on this Atlantic perspective with the Justinian Reconquest, a massive reason for recovering the Western Mediterranean. And that, of course, the Longobards migrated in Italy just because they thought to conquer it for their own. Of course, they weren't as Romanized as the Goths. This is something I often say, my migration era videos. So Cantor says it too, and so, like, what's the point? Right? This is yet another mistake. What are we talking about? How do you imagine the Goths being in the moment they settled in Italy or in Spain? And the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, by the way, were quite different people between them. And I would argue that the Visigoths were actually much more difficult to integrate than the Ostrogoths, even though they had spent much more time within the Roman Empire than the Ostrogoths did. So first of all, that is an interesting view on the thing. But secondly, how do you think the Longobards differed from the Ostrogoths in the moment they respectively settled in Italy? Do you think they were so different? Right, peoples that had essentially both shared in common, like the fact they had never been settled in the Roman Empire before, they had stayed under the Huns, they had even fought against the Romans, and how do you think the actual difference really were? Here you talk, for example, just about the Goths, and have you ever posed yourself the problem of checking what, in this sense, Cantor or any other historian throwing that notion on the table is actually understanding what that literally means, and who were the Goths? That is a Roman ethnographic invention, by the way, and you may see as a broader major stamp or indicator and kind of proof that whatever here Cantor was assessing. Here I'm saying you. I don't want to provoke the author of the video. Maybe he will not even realize I made a bitter response, but I say you to any person who is kind of trying to make a point on this base. So I'm really more talking to Cantor, to the dead. Rest in peace. Really, I have nothing against Cantor specifically. If I had not been posed this question, I would have neither cared, because I can easily say that an author like Cantor is not even to be cared for in a broader historiographical sense, considering what's the state of historiography today, and that's something I can easily say if you know what my curriculum is, what I study, what I do, what I work with. So this aspect is crucial. Right, the Ostrogoths, I think, were much more Romanly appreciated because they ruled in an Italy that had not been destroyed in her late antique system. The Longobards came to rule over the peninsula after the Gothic War, and that changes the entire story, right? Because simply at that point, yes, it's true that the Italian political and social system changes more evidently, but even in here historically, there is not a way to distinguish that from the disaster of the Gothic War, and in relation to, say, whatever Longobards culture was really about. What one should rather look at is what the Longobards managed to accomplish, exactly because they were actual barbarians coming from Central Europe, not having probably ever had an idea what the Mediterranean really was, and how it worked there. Because if you measure the Longobard accomplishments on this base, this was by far one of the single most successfully Germanic peoples to date. And again, the reason why people today do not care about the story of the fact that the Longobards eventually became civilized, that the pride of the Longobard kingdom, it's unity. It was the only functional elective monarchy to date in a state that was one and that worked as such cooperatively among all the various duchies, and also within this system also a centralized state, especially in Lombardy and in Tuscany. For those standards, was literally a state. The dukes were literate. They attended properly. They worked. They knew the documents. They knew in the trials the law. The Edictum Rotary is by far the single most important Germanic law production. This is widely known in Germanistics. Is a triumphant success of politics, of administration. Here, the question says, Cantor mentions how the Longobards weren't close in the Roman sphere of influence like Goths, and they didn't know Latin. Yeah, because what do you think, that the Goths kind of knew Latin so better than the Longobards? First of all, the Goths interacted with what was, yes, still formerly a Latin-speaking state, but in the practice of the people, mostly were much more exposed to a Greek influence. So what do you think that the Visigoths dwelling in the Balkans sent to fight on the Persian frontier, when they settled in Aquitaine, they had any broader kind of take or understanding of what really the thing was? Of course, they were more habituated to the Mediterranean, to how the state worked there. They were essentially created as a people by the Romans that made their provincial army out of them, and so they were framed within that system. But the concept is they were still pretty much the same people from the Barbaricum that the Longobards in many ways were. And the Romanization, the Latinization of the of the Longobards is pretty, it's common history. Like for any other Germanic people in the post-Roman Europe, it took 2-3 generations really to see that there was no difference between the conquerors and the local population at large, because the most important families were surely powerful clans, etc., but they were the ones that had Romanized the fastest. I mean, Longobard kings lived in Milan, watching the chariot races in the local circus. It's not really a very Germanic custom, living in a palace with a Latin administration. That is something that they came, obviously, to do, because guess what? Human beings are intelligent when they are, especially under straits. They know how they start to make things work well. And the interesting part of the question also, albeit a sad one, if Cantor actually wrote this, is particularly Cantor mentions the first Longobard Code of Law, which was also the only one, telling the truth, which he said was written in broken Latin and was much more concerned with the regulation of their own Germanic customs than the ruling and functioning of the state. All right, here I doubt that even Cantor said anything like this. I mean, it's literally not possible. Or even if I have to believe you, because otherwise I would mean that you didn't understand much, this is just not wrong because there is any chance to interpret this. This is badly and seriously wrong. I mean, if someone has pretended to study a Longobard history, a Lombard history class, and came up with this, it's because they literally didn't open their books, and they can't pass the exam. I don't know what here the thing was. First of all, their first code of law has an intelligible Latin. I read the edictum myself multiple times. It's a very interesting document. It's a typically Germanically structured work. That is to say, all the Germanic laws are, of course, more primitive than the Roman one that was very sophisticated. It has all institutions. It was a very complex, scientifically built theory, and it would work, in fact, later on pretty well. And we'll talk about the Longobardists in this context later. But broken Latin, what does it mean exactly, broken Latin? Right? Because in early medieval Europe, normally people all kind of wrote in one way, right? Broken Latin, first of all, doesn't take in consideration one thing. What is that they use one vowel rather than another. They write in a Latin that they thought it was classical Latin, but it wasn't because they were not adequately educated. The edictum came out of the royal palace chancery, and it was written actually in good Latin, in normal Latin. I mean, it's not that it's very complex to write in Latin in a country where the 97 to 99% of the population was speaking Romance, right? So the question is, what were normally people talking at the time, and why, would a normal linguistical evolution from classical Latin that was probably never spoken outside from the, the elite circles of the true literates, and and so on, would be really a proof of cultural underdevelopment. And this thing, the Longobards were much more concerned with the regulation of their Germanic customs than the ruling and functioning of the state. Whoever wrote this, either Cantor or the author of the comment, I would like to remember that the Edictum Rotary was the core of the single most advanced juridical culture in the Middle Ages until the recovery of Roman law, and that was disciplining the most urbanized, literate, and per capita wealthy country in the world at the time, that was Italy, uninterruptedly, even after the fall of the Roman Empire, and that is the same place from which, the place notoriously in mediavistics that had the fastest political and social development in these centuries, starting, by the way, from the Longobards that stabilized the system, is the one from which the thing starts rising again. I mean, if you study the history of the dictum, you know that there were the additions of the various various kings, including Liutprand. That was really the apex also in his reign of the Longobards kingdom in the first place. You can see there the wealth, you can see there the negotiable practice, the literacy, and more. I understand that normally the Middle Ages do not pass for this, but Cantor, as I was saying before, is also a person that studies just a narrow part of northwestern European history during the high Middle Ages in detail of a true researcher. All the rest does not exist, and this is unfortunately the attitude that we still find today in most of the world, because eventually the Anglosphere, that was a bit biased in that direction, spread common historical knowledge, also thanks to true works, at least like Cantor's, to peoples that literally knew nothing before about European history. I mean, in India, I'm sure that people study the Middle Ages in a way that is brutally influenced by anything that has been written in the Anglosphere. I don't mean that this is bad. As I said before, I have a great respect for the Anglosphere from the broader Western world, the Anglo-American world, and its offspring, let's say. But one must acknowledge today that it's impossible to pretend that that's the only source to understand what we need to know in order to have a functional civilizational capacity. The West is a concept that goes beyond those boundaries, and not because it's the inclusive multicultural bullshit. That is also important in the sense that, yes, there was a time of great exchange, blending. There's much more than, especially in the Middle Ages, that the Christian, the Jewish, and the Muslim world had in some ways. And this cannot be denied, but this has literally nothing to do with the fact that if you express such asinine ideas about, in this case, the Edictum Rotary, and you basically ignore what the entire work in continental Europe of major national historiographies, like the Italian one, like the French one, like the German, could be anyone's. And this means that you're not essentially a Westerner. All right? Westerners is something that goes beyond Europe, but has its roots in Europe. And so if you don't understand those roots, if you don't know the importance of the Edictum in the history of the world, not just in Western civilization, but consequently, you cannot understand what Westerner means. And this is an extremely serious problem. So that comments like this make me realize how alive it really is, right? This maybe the comment of the author of the comment was unlucky because he read Cantor as opposed to another author, right? But still Cantor existed, wrote the stuff, people read it, and they believed this, right? So this is a problem. It may be, again, I don't have the quote from Cantor here, so I don't know what he's saying. But what I am told here, it seems to me, without any reason of doubt, pretty reasonably based on some, on the experience of having read Cantor and having come across my content, and being fairly detailed with this information, is enough to tell me of the problem, right? And coming back to the atrocious statement that the Longobards, let's first of all, as I said before, what do you think that in 643 who wrote the edictum in Latin, by the way, not in Germanic, not in Latin, for Longobards, by the way, because the thing is issued at a point where literally, yes, the Italians at large had become Longobards, and that's how they were universally known abroad from that point onwards. But that specifically refers to freemen, right? The edictum is based on that kind of Germanic base, for which you understand that there is a pretty wide range of people that obviously encompass the entire population, and these are Longobards. And yes, the right is for the Germans, but anybody who has studied medieval law and Germanistics in general, and I made a video last summer that talked exactly about this, that is titled "How the Romans Chose to Become Germans," and I had lots of videos, and a lot of views. People liked it very much because it's actually how the thing went, and that nobody says out loud. Is obviously that everybody had become at that point ethnically, which in that case means juridically, German. Everybody was a Longobard there, first of all. And if you wanted to remain a Roman, in the sense that you wanted to use Roman law, and this is very well disciplined, by the way, in the later times when there was a lot of commercial interaction, also with the still Roman-held areas, the Longobards annexated the Exarchate, so there were subjects there that had remained instead Romans juridically for centuries, and that actually had grown pretty similar to the Longobards, because these were provinces that were now far away from Constantinople in a political sense, and culturally speaking, definitely they had never been something different from what the Italian peninsula fundamentally was about. Are properly addressed. Like, if you want to be like, we are kings of the Longobards. If you want to still use the Roman thing, do it. We actually allow you to use it, we discipline it, and we absolutely accept it, right? So, of course, what by the 7th century this means, also because we don't find any other trace of Romans, right? So it's not that these were living in caves hidden somewhere. Again, the entire political, social landscape tells us pretty clearly what the Longobard world was about. It's one of the best documented in Europe. We know pretty well that this edictum was disciplining the entire population under Longobard control, right? That is within, at that point, properly the Longobard kingdom, that was titled, by the way, since those eras, Regnum Totius Italiae, which was a way of saying, yes, there are still Byzantines here and there, especially on the coast and in the cities. So the hinterland was Longobard up to the far south. And this is deeply important from a cultural point of view, because it means that the bulk of the demographic bulk, the peasantry, were essentially had sided with the Longobards and had wanted, for very specific reasons, escaping Byzantine fiscalism and essentially a foreign domination, not the one of, again, foreigners that had settled in Italy and become de facto Italians, was prevalent, was dominant. And it would remain so, because these are laws that arrived up to the 19th century in some Italian pre-unitary states, juridical system. So this is also, and of course, because during the rest of the Middle Ages, Longobard law and this terribly brutal edictum turned out to work dramatically well for also much more advanced realities at the core. And so is regarded in juridical history as one of the greatest successes in legislation in the history of medieval Europe. And here I cannot, address responsibles specifically, because I don't know here who said what exactly about this atrocious statement about the edictum rotary. And believe me, there are deep things regarding this. For example, the aforementioned video I made last spring about the Longobards was actually a social history video, and it was dealing exactly with this aspect. That is true. The Longobard era and the immediate, let's say, aftermath, we have one of the brightest pictures of the passage from essentially the colonial slavery to free landholding, right? So not just a process of course, this happened because the latifundium had collapsed during the Gothic War. The Longobards spread their own kind of Germanic egalitarianism because their culture worked like that, and it turned out to be extremely to be winning in a country like that, where finally all these masses had been freed from the great landowners and would side with the Longobards exactly because they were giving them, as the late Goths did by freeing them specifically, freedom. So to be Germanic peers, essentially. That's why, by the way, also in the rest of Western Europe, the juridical ethnic identity Germanized and was so extremely successful in countries that are Romance still today, and in the largest form of success of that mechanism, in France, in Italy, in Spain. Because this is exactly the positive accomplishment that the Longobards achieved. For not talking about administration, what this all entailed, literally, again, the Longobard juridical system was by far the most advanced in Latin-Germanic Europe. There is no way around it. This is notorious. Again, the level of literacy, we know through cartularies, through documenting transaction testaments, etc., that people used the edictum, that it worked, that royal justice was there. People could afford that. This helped stabilizing, on the longer run, the entire system. There was a civil development. Women had an important juridical autonomy, even though in origin the Germanic institutions, as you know, were extremely strict towards women, which is something that today some racial supremacists want to switch by saying that the Norse, you see, here women could divorce. They couldn't divorce in the way you intend, like today's, right, and claiming that those were the modern peoples of the past that the terrible Christians blamed. No, the most advanced countries in Europe at the time, by far, were these ones in the south, where we can document pretty well what that kind of juridical, economic, properly personal liberty really was about. And with significant life standards. Again, this was uninterruptedly the richest country in the world per capita. Literally the richest country in the world per capita. So, has anybody ever heard that? Like, if you are even listening to this video for the first time, has anyone ever told you this? Ever? Do you realize the historical implications of this? Not just of what it was at the time, but of the fact that you personally did not know this, maybe up to now. Do you realize that there are like tens of thousands of works written on these topics, to say the least, and that they are accessible by anyone, and that nobody gives a shit because, of course, they prefer to buy Cantor's books because they are for essentially dumb people. This is a massive civilizational problem. it's a radical moral and scientific shortcoming that we cannot afford as humans. Like, we cannot hope to manage the world if this is the basic state of affairs. I'm not saying that every person should know about the addictum rotary without being considered an idiot. But let's say if you have any historical interest of sort, and the point is, I have just this, like the standards are Schwerpunkt and Cantor. There is a problem. There is a problem. Like, say, and you can't go beyond them. You can't maybe ask anyone else. Like this, I don't know, maybe the author of this comment at some point has already found out in a couple of days his answer, aside from what I'm trying to do here. But something tells me it's rather unlikely. Right? So in particular, this comment is interesting because from one side it gives you hope. Like, this person is posing himself the problem. It doesn't say, well, this one of the two is just an idiot. I'm asking that. Now, this is very intelligent, according to me, right? As the entire question is intelligent because he's asking about very specific things. So I like this aspect, but if I read certain things, I just lose it. I can't avoid to do so for the aforementioned reason. And again, on the linguistic point also, I think it's worth remembering that the addictum, first of all, is written in Latin, and it was, by the way, a quite widely used work. We know it, again, through the aforementioned the literal legal practice that we have dating from Longobard times that is abundant considering the early medieval standards, and for the reasons I explained, in literacy, in societal complexity and wealth and so on. But especially the addictum for every Germanist is like, oh my God, here we have a first half of the 7th century Romano-Germanic king that is legislating such a pretty sizable work. The addictum is not small; it's actually a pretty long thing, right? There are over 200 laws in it, and then eventually there are the additions to it of the later kings, and it's like an enormous mine of information. I know specifically one expert, and she told me about that. Like, she's an old lady, right? And she has been studying that for most of her life at this point. And she tells me, well, that's her historical philosophy, but she's right about it because it's true for every source in a way, but for such a sizable amount of information, like every time you read it, you learn something, you discover something new, right? This is the power of knowledge, that when you actually get into the specifics of this work, that is describing your reality as it was, because it's literally talking about the problems that these people had, that the broader community had, and they are not little problems, right? People maybe are struck by those things. If you cut somebody's nose, you have to pay this amount of money. But the question is, that's just picturesque. I get you that. There are also funnier stories. Like, you can't blame the owner of a horse if the horse kicks and breaks somebody's bones, right? This kind of things. But aside from that, you have no idea, if you at least haven't gotten in the specifics of the juridical history analysis, of how much that actually reveals about those words, because it's an incredibly complex system. It doesn't stop to that line, and of course I'm just saying the funniest things, but there are deep, radical, political, ideological, institutional, legal issues, including the same way this edictum was formulated. Because definitely we're still talking about an early medieval polity, so even though it was so tidy and actually well-functioning, there were still many issues that were somewhat quite serious to address and to solve. And it turns out, historically, politically, legally, we know that this work helped enormously to fix them. And as you know, there was a great deal of continuity in the later centuries. We would maybe address it later, but still on the linguistic side of the story, there is a beautiful idea of the blend, the cultural blend of a dominant Romance speaking reality with, however, the popular acknowledgement of Germanic terms. Because the Longobard language is an Elbe Germanic one, so it's very similar to, let's say, it's of the same branch of the Bavarian, of Swabian, also properly what was known as Alemannic, that was a dialect spoken. Also, there are some little islands that are dying in the Alps across. And this, I don't know if you ever read anything in Longobard, but it's beautiful. It's a ferocious language. It is true. The Longobards were ferocious. That we know that. When Tiberius conquered Germany and he found them on the Elbe, he called them, this people was more ferocious than Germanic ferocity. There was something about them that was believed, even in the same fact that their ethnonym had survived. It's one of the few Germanic peoples that were known since probably 100 BC at least, because for the Romans to have found the Longobards called like this when they invaded Germany, they were already pretty clearly defined as such in a ethnogenetic sense, and they remained the Longobards. Other peoples changed their names. There are very few Germanic groups that kind of maintain the name. And I think the Longobards are truly the only ones that maintain that in a straight linear succession, right? They were a people, first of all. They were a people that was deeply proud of its own compactness, of the fact that there wasn't a single king, that their force was revered as a military one, was due to this political conviction. They were also Woden's adoptive sons, and they even included their women in that kind of legacy, in the myth, if you know how they were named by Saint Woden as Longobards, from Vinnili as they were known as before. And in any case, their language was hissing. It sounds like the one of a snake. There are some beautiful words that were inserted in Germanic, straight, in the edictum when there were certain specific concepts that juridically that they thought that in Latin would have not been expressed adequately, or that would have been equivocated juridically in the particular Germanic shape and semantics that they actually had. So we find in this Latin code still, however, these words, and they're not just a few, which enrich the work. And it shows, first of all, one, that the Italian population at large was habituated to that, to know, that they knew exactly what those terms literally meant in German. And secondly, that the work behind this, that even if it was made by people who also were probably of original Roman descent, we know actually of Roman aristocrats, especially in the areas of the Neustria in the northwest between Milan and Pavia, that was the Longobard Neustria, just like the Franks, they had the two, east and west. They helped administratively. These were some Roman aristocrats that essentially began to work in the Longobard court. They eventually married into them, things like this. And of course, there was an important effort made linguistically, juridically, to define very carefully also the language of the dictum. And it's absolutely not a random, primitive, brutal work. They chose very carefully in this pretty big code what to insert. And it's simply a masterpiece. And the importance of the edictum, as I was hinting at before, is demonstrated by the fact that, first of all, the state worked, right? The Longobards didn't tear each other apart like the Franks or the Visigoths, exactly because the latifundium, differently from Gaul and Spain, was not destroyed. Maybe there's a comparison there with, was destroyed in Italy, and so as a consequence, the aristocracies were not so powerful, and the best they could aspire to was to compete within the royal, say, administration career, which was incidentally also a urban career. The Longobards ruled from cities. The kings, the dukes, were city people, right? They ruled from cities over a countryside that, differently from Central Europe, for example, didn't have areas that were not connected with the city, right? Because Italy is somehow, as you know, narrow, and there are the mountains in the middle, and so all the population, which is sizable, is concentrated in some places. In fact, Italy still today has the highest demographic concentration in Europe for this reason. This means a lot in the history of the country, and already at the time, you have these noblemen that essentially are ruling from the city, as it would happen later, also during communal times with the seigneuries and so on, because that was the center of the world. And the word of the city is consistently different from others. Like, think about the Merovingians. They ruled from cities too, but they de facto lived elsewhere. And they had these huge mansions in the countryside. Their world was much more rural in a political sense. I mean, because of course all people at the time were well, aside from nomads in some ways at least, were rural in that regard. But the degree of urbanization of, for example, even commercial activity, the naval contacts, the broader continuity with Roman time was pretty powerful in Longobard times. And you see, also regarding this question, say, people often confuse what it means to be, in the sense, a barbarian or a German or a Roman, right? For example, there are many people who think that the Franks were more Romanized than the Goths. Sometimes they tell you, because here in the comments, etc., because they lived close to the Roman Empire for a longer time. That has literally nothing to do with that. It has to do with where they lived was like. And no, yes, literally the Goths were definitely more Romanized than the Franks, as we know well. The Longobards were somehow similar to the Franks in that, I mean, maybe even less, that is true, maybe even less Romanized. But again, the fact that you're not Romanized as much as others doesn't mean that you can't create the most civilly successful Romano-Germanic kingdoms, right, from a Germanic migration. And I would say the Longobard one is the best example of this. So already kind of having these points clearly outlined is not easy, believe me. I am totally sympathetic, again, with the author of this question, because it's normal to have these questions. I had them myself back in the day. And why? Because nobody had taught me. Because the academy wouldn't simply tell it. And books wouldn't even care about it, and would just probably, like Cantor's ones, add so many unnecessary details that at the end of the day they don't make you understand the core issues. And this is unfortunately what most of our problems as a civilization are today. Then there is the conclusive part. Okay, I didn't finish to explain the thing of the dictum future fortune, because first of all, as you know, the Longobard kingdom was so well administered that when the Carolingians conquered it, they didn't impose them their own law. They had it surviving in the institutional system of the Carolingian Empire. All the other peoples that were conquered by the Franks were essentially ruled over, whereas the Longobards became a sort of parallel state of some sort in importance, given that the same Charlemagne took on the Longobard crown. He was the next Longobard king. No other people in the Carolingian Empire outside the Franks had their own crown. Right? This is deeply important. The local administration was maintained. There was a big deal of influence, naturally, of legal practice from both sides in a way. But the most important thing the Franks did was drawing from a Roman culture, that their court worked in a much more ideological sense than in an administrative statal one, as you know, because there was factually no state north of the Alps. In any case, as you know, to make the very long story short, Italy was first a Carolingian kingdom on its own. I made a video about it recently. Then it remained within also what was later the Holy Roman Empire. The Ottonians hinged Italy to the Northern Empire, and they consolidated together with Burgundy, eventually with Bohemia, like what we know as the Holy Roman Empire. This was the Italic kingdom, so literally the Longobard one, that was changed in name also to stress, in part, yes, that idea that there were multiple, say there was a broader ambition. In part was juridical, because the Franks had brought also their own juridical ethnicity in Italy, and so if they called it Italy instead than Longobardy, it was easier to transition the kind of the conquest phase and so on. And later also because, of course, there was a broader ambition, as the same Longobard ones had to take over the entire peninsula, which, for example, the Longobards were about to accomplish, including Rome and the entire continental territory before the Franks took over. In this phase, especially in the 11th century, as you know, the communal phenomenon took over, and so the cities grew ever more as the center of power, and especially one of as the seat of a local urban government of some sort. First, based on the episcopal comital power of kind of feudal hierarchical origin, but eventually this was taken over properly by the local commune, because that was created. And in this phase, that is objectively a pre-humanistic one, that was characterized, as you know, by the economical and demographic booming of these centers, a bit like old Western Europe, but ever more, especially with the context of with a broader world. The Italians shipped the crusading expeditions. They were treasuring an incredible amount. They had shifted the trade balance, right? Now all the precious metal was more concentrated in the northern shores of the Mediterranean rather than in the southern ones, like in the moment of Islamic hegemony. There was a broader development that naturally included a further juridical need and to regulate this enormously dynamic system, like all the money, all the property, etc. And as a consequence, an early medieval code of law was insufficient alone to make the thing work. However, the edictum had remained the core of all the juridical system that had been developing also in between these times. Let's see, as you know, in the Studium of Bologna, the first European university, the reconstruction, the recovery of Roman law from the Byzantine manuscripts and so on. Let's say, eventually Roman law, as you know, in Europe became some sort of school of crystallized, theory that had in fact consolidated in the late medieval Bolognese studies and so on, that had reconstructed the corpus juris civilis and had eventually adapted to the medieval reality, partly to the modern one. But it's important to stress that, first of all, the Roman law was not recovered by these Italian communal scholars that were lawyers specifically, right? These were laymen with an enormous education, and so to be able to reconstruct also this older manuscripts, etc., it's a very complex thing. I made lots of videos about this, but they weren't essentially to say, okay, well, Roman law is better, so we need simply to substitute the stuff we have here now. It didn't go like this. Essentially, what the law they used to rule these communes was, as the core, the edictum. Then added to it in the same form that the Longobards had settled since Rotary, the various additions of the other kings. The fact that the kingdom of Italy, as I was saying before, had remained the same one from Longobard to Carolingian times helped a lot through also the Holy Roman Empire, etc., because it was the same kingdom. It was the same palace that issued the same legal system in a way. So first, this broader collections included the edictum, the additions to it, the Carolingian capitularies, the feudal laws issued by the Holy Roman emperors. Then there were some customs too that were being added because all these lawyers that were studying and applying this law for all the transactions, all the contracts and so on, were expanding on their own the studied interpretation of this corpus. And the core of this was the edictum, so much that these lawyers were known as Longobardists, that is to say, the Italian communal civilization of the 11th century that would eventually bring to, in many ways as a parallel civilizational achievement to the great feudal one of France and so on. And deeply intertwined with that, because this was of a European scale phenomenon, was essentially moving its steps from the fact that the edictum was still used in such a complex world, which is a dramatic witness to the effectiveness and the intelligence and the practical applicability of the edictum. It was not a primitive thing at all. It's one of the most radically sophisticated for the time being. You have to consider this for the time being, right? So, juridical work. So, if Cantor ever said something, again, so idiotic, like that this was written in broken Latin and in it the Longobards were concerned with regulation of their customs rather than the ruling and functioning of the state, well, the easiest thing I can tell you, wherever you read this, trash it. Like, read it, think about it, but consider it as trash, because it is literal trash. I suggest you pick any, Wickham wrote very interesting things about Longobard Italy. There is also Capo's works that are very good. Arnaldi too, for a broader idea of Longobard history and everything that has been written from them, for them. There are lots of other authors, because actually the edictum is a very interesting topic academically. Like, lots of people from lots of different countries studied that, which tells you also how complex the entire thing really is. So again, I don't think there is anything to prove or to convince. This is just plain what you call mainstream kind of opinion on what this. It's not even, you see, a person who may not be, let's say, habituated to historiographical debate may think, just like in this question, what the hell do I know whether a scholar is saying the truth or the other? How do I have the scale of that? Well, there is no other way but reading other works, right? If you realize just by the sheer complexity of analysis that what Cantor said is just, like a high school student would think of this problem, like even in the worst of cases, probably, because some high school students are definitely knowledgeable enough to understand that this is not even a serious thing to say. And again, what is being written and studied in noise ants about this topic, well, you would realize what we're practically talking about. So that it's not just by labeling something as barbarian or uneducated that you set the same standards of those words, semantics. What does it mean by the 7th century uneducated? Who wrote the edictum by 7th century standards was actually pretty well educated. It's I don't like the word nonsense because it sounds so dismissively posh that I don't like to use, but I literally see no sense in a statement like that other than, I want to appear smart because I criticize something that is out of my, my horizon, and that is not my special thing, right? And there are deep implications, again, also in the way Cantor saw the rest of the world and in history. Again, the guy was extremely confined to the to the notion that, of course, just the Anglosphere is the one that produced the best stuff, right? And again, I understand where it comes from with that. I'm not criticizing the concept per se. I disagree with it. But it's not because I have anything against the Anglosphere. On the contrary, I think that if I also speak or reason in a somewhat decent way, is thanks to the Anglosphere, even though I evidently don't come from the Anglosphere. So I don't have any problem. But be aware that people reasoned like that. And in this regard, because as a continental European, I care very much about certain names in historiography, there's a broader issue about Cantor that should be pointed out. He essentially did something interesting in analyzing the impact that different authors had on, let's say, the way we look at the Middle Ages. I mean, he even talks about Tolkien, he talks about Bloch, that we will address now, Haskins, Power, and so on. There is naturally a very different weight that he gives to all these names, and very unfairly. So actually the reason why Cantor, and this is why I also say it to the last, is so controversial and legitimately so in historiography, is that he essentially talks shit about names like Bloch, like Kantorowicz, and this is unforgivable objectively. For example, he blamed Kantorowicz for essentially being a Nazi, which is something that you don't say to a person that had to leave Germany exactly because he was a Jew in Nazi times, and that had his mother killed in the Holocaust, and that was, yes, it was Kantorowicz. If you know his story, he's very famous for his masterwork on Frederick II that in many ways embodied the zeitgeist of the time as a German national. He was a Jew. There's many great German patriots. He was a fervent German nationalist with a Jewish background, a veteran World War I, so etc. All the story, and many of these people were involved, in fact, even in, they liked this extremization of German nationalism, and they were in love with what was the broader temper of the times. I mean, nationalism was rampant. It was a normal thing, right, to exalt your own nation, your own people, your own culture. The Germans had this imperial myth and culture and so on. And Kantorowicz fled to the United States and eventually repented bitterly, of course, for all he had gone through as he was discriminated against. He began to change the idea, of course, for the same fact that eventually he had to move out of Germany when Nazis rose to power. and he is by far one of the greatest minds and legends in historiography. I mean, if you read Frederick II, which is not Nazi propaganda, also because the Nazis at the time didn't quite, they weren't in power, they weren't a thing yet, and so this a masterpiece of mental superiority and erudition. Kantorowicz, you also learned the name. I think he was born in Poznan when the Second Reich still ruled it, and Poznan eventually would become actually the capital of Polish anti-Semitism also, when it became Poland again. So Kantorowicz, you hear the name, you look at his face, it's evidently kind of, it's not an Aryan, right? Conceptually, you realize there's some Easternness of some sort, either from whatever his Jewish background really was about, or he could easily look Polish, or some type of German that definitely didn't conform to the racial mythology of it all. And so, Cantor saying to a person like this that went through this kind of things, that is recognized as one of the greatest geniuses in historiography, like, I don't know, you just have to read him. Read Frederick II and then read whatever and compare it at this point with the book that you read from Cantor, whichever it is. There is not even comparison. The same goes for Bloch, Marc Bloch, who, as a French author, also with a great interest in German history, that eventually refused. Of course, he was assassinated by the Nazis as a Jew, and as a member of the French resistance, by the way. And Bloch, I like him as a person, even though I'm ideologically against his work, because he essentially resumed structuralism. He opened a path that, in my opinion, did not help civilizationally, and that we're still paying kind of the price of, not because of Bloch or other, Lefebvre, other, like a friend of his that had to witness also his death, and at least to acknowledge it in the media, in the terrible things that were happening at the end of the war. But this was a guy who was killed, being shot, crying "Vive la France," by the way, and reassuring a 16-year-old next to him that was being shot next to him because he feared the pain that the bullets would cause. This is the kind of stories for which I think somebody like Cantor cannot even afford to say anything so childishly provocative like Bloch, as he did. Bloch was, probably made more noise, a historian, kind of dead than alive, right? This kind of statements, like, what the fuck are you to talk like this about these people? Like, Bloch was a great historian. He wrote well. He wrote very intelligent things, even in the structuralistic ideas, even in the reasons that may have brought him in that regard, because it was a broader protest against, for example, he was very impressed by the Dreyfus affair in France, anti-Semitism. He was the typical French, but with a Jewish background, he didn't consider personally even so important. He said, first of all, I'm a French, right? In many ways, like this, there is an analogy with Kantorowicz in spite of the different political siding in a way. But these are giants of history, because they wrote, first of all, they had the courage of taking specific paths and going on them and exploring and opening very important branches of historiography and or reaching the pinnacle of them. They're giants of historiography. When you read on the internet why people dislike Cantor, well, because he wrote these things about this historians, and you find written, well, but you see, the only people who were pissed off by this is just the pupils of those historians. Well, this is not really true. I'm not a pupil, or I didn't have the privilege of being, of course, also for anographic reasons, a pupil of Kantorowicz or of Ernst Kantorowicz and Mark Bloch, but I have a pretty good understanding of what was the base they came from, to the point of not having properly even the idea of allowing myself to criticize their, let's say, the imposance and the well-deserved fame of their historiographical value. I can disagree with some of their ideas. I disagree with everybody's ideas as far as that's a positive thing in the right measure. But of course I would never say, Bloch was an idiot, or Kantorowicz was an idiot, or was a dirty Nazi, right? This is not exactly how you cope with a person. By the way, especially Kantorowicz, not just was very sensitive eventually for what happened, he had, as you can imagine, remorses for all his life, but he was also opposed to McCarthyism in the United States. This is interesting because the same Cantor was conservative. He thought that Marxism was also some kind of temporary fashion. He was wrong, because Marxism is not a temporary fashion. It's just Marxism in itself, even though Marxists probably themselves do not know it because they don't study tradition, is just the repetition of the usual kind of chthonic, demonic, regurgitation of mankind in historical perspective. But let's say, at least, he could point out that any kind of, redemption from such horrifying ideologies such as Marxism or Nazism is to be appreciated. And in this sense, Kantorowicz, I don't know whether maybe Cantor did it at some point about him, but in general, you don't talk to him like this was just an imbecile Nazi who had to run to the United States because he was too stupid to understand that he wanted to kill all the Jews in time, right? This is kind of an idiotic point, as many others that we've seen here. So my general impression is that there is a very good reason for resenting such an author in general. And I have also found some positive reviews about him that I think circle a bit around the point. For example, here, I don't know, this was even a letter, I think, from relatives that wrote this on the internet between pupils and relatives. And one says, "I like to read good historical writing," in caps. "I was mainly interested in how history was written and presented more than the actual events themselves. My knowledge of history in terms of facts and chronology was then and has always been weak." Well, it's not something to be proud of, right? If you don't have a strong knowledge of facts and chronology, what's the point of studying history, or even the interpretation of history, or the history of historiography? You can't do that. Like, if you pretend to study the history of historiography and dig in what different historians thought and said, you must know forcefully history before, because otherwise you don't even know what these people are talking about, and you can't evaluate how they're talking about. And this seems exactly the problem with Cantor, because given the judgments that he expressed about various authors, it seems to me just like, if you want to follow that, if you want to enjoy that, it's just by learning how to smear others, rather than appreciating maybe the actual historical value of these people that you can incidentally reconstruct historically. Like, it's a bit difficult to judge figures like Bloch and Kantorowicz if you don't study their own facts and chronology. Of course, Cantor did. So this phrase that I quoted is inconsistent even with the same support to Cantor. The problem is that Cantor probably in that also used some evidence, as every historian can do based on facts and chronology, to also distort the interpretation or expressing judgments that sound a bit more like an intellectual biography than than anything. So again, I'm not very fond of the broader author. Again, I don't have anything against Cantor in a personal sense. Again, say aside from these things that I learned of, because again, I don't have the data to connect these statements to eventually what the person would have responded to criticism like. So I'm open, I'm possibilist regarding to but it's just a undue gift that I'm doing, because generally speaking, whenever I hear such things and I consider the broader context, I can easily come to the conclusion that here there was not much of a historical consistency. And in fact, I think my greatest criticism in general, especially for as an advice to those who want to know, as the author of this question, one of my videos, really is the actual history, is that Cantor is not an author that you can read to find answers like those, because he's mostly famous for having written bestseller books that were such because they were pretty generic, right? I know many other authors that wrote books like that, and those were both by people that read these things, didn't even understand the disaster that was made in them in an historical sense, but felt all entitled because that guy said this, so this is what the other surfers didn't read, so this guy's my hero and I am a hero for saying that. And this is the, again, typically populistic mentality deriving from the you see, this is not even about being liberal conservative, as you know. This is just mirroring the collapse of the mass responsibility towards knowledge, and the fact that, again, the masses were brought to know things, but to have at large no mean to do it effectively, and so developing this paranoias in the moment in which the masses are going to sink again against these elites, can be scholarly, can be whatever, because they are the problem at the end of the day. They cannot afford to keep their rights floating because they're weak and lazy and cowardly. And so they try to find figures that tell them, this guy is understandable because he talks to me in a way I can understand. Well, if you can't understand complex things or more in-depth things or whatever, it's not because those who write complex things are not capable of expressing themselves. Very often those who write complex things are the ones that know better, because they have more than a point to make, and especially based on evidence, and that's how the entire historiography works. Cantor just fits in that kind of, again, second half of the 20th century average scholar that succeeded in his career for whichever reason, that evidently wasn't much of a specific historical quality, and that thought well to, instead of improving his historical knowledge, just to start telling the world what he felt about history rather than researching history, and this is terrifying, considering the popularity of the man, but definitely not his fame as a highly qualified scholar and a researcher. So I don't. That's the best take I can give you, and so I'm glad to address these topics because I realized that my intuitions in the following years regarding what are the main orientation problems for people are exactly the ones that I see, that I encounter every day, and there is no way around it. Before telling history, we have to set the basics straight, because otherwise it's useless, right? And the only way for doing that is actually providing with a sound point and not with I just heard this guy saying something extremely generalistic about a people, and then and that's it. By the way, I didn't finish actually to comment on the question, because there was the last thing about the monastic thing of the Longobards, the dynastic policy of the Longobards. So let's do this relatively quickly, because this was the end of the question. In another book about monasticism, forgot the name right now, it's not important by the way, it said that the Longobards, of course, destroyed/dispersed the early Benedictine monasteries, in brackets, although they later funded the creation of new ones. So even here, of course, it's the point. First of all, the destruction of Monte Cassino in the 70s and the 80s of the 6th century is a very famous fact, because it's one of the, sadly enough, of the multiple destructions of one of the single most important monasteries in the history of mankind. But it's important to stress that Cantor was a bit more interested in monastic history than others. He dedicates to also some monastic history experts a greater amount of space in his historiographical criticisms and so on. So I think where he may have touched the topic. In any case, another point about Cantor is that he was trying to speak for the broader Western civilization. Like in his work, the point was to set the grounds of saying what were the figures that changed the world, right? Cantor, as far as I understand, was one of those people who tend to follow others, right? To say there were some people, and we have to go after them, either for better or for worse, right? And so not making actual history again about reality for what it is, also beyond what single people can appreciate, even though we can use them definitely. Just I'm doing right now with Cantor himself in this kind of questions, and reconstructing it. So here it says, it's said that the Longobards destroyed/dispersed the early Benedictine monasteries. No, right? And this, I think, is a mistake from the author of the comment, because I doubt that even Cantor got these things wrong. As I said before, Monte Cassino was destroyed by a wandering Longobard force, who in that time was at war with the Byzantines in Italy, and Monte Cassino led in the territory of Rome, that was the Pope's, and controlled by Byzantine forces, and the Longobards came and sacked and destroyed this place because of the riches and all. Of course, at the time, we're talking about the years of the ducal anarchy, or slightly later, before they're those years anyhow. And they, before Authority brought order, let's say, killing more Longobards than Byzantines in the process, by the way. And first of all, it's a normal thing. Like, you see this everywhere. Like, there were destructions along the frontier, there were sackings, etc. This was still a phase in which we called the ducal anarchy, because after Albo and Clef were assassinated, those were the first kings of the Longobards, altogether, that, as we've said, were an elective, they elected their rulers in typical Germanic fashion. They hadn't established the kingdom institutionally yet. Decided to not elect a king at that moment. And so everybody did more or less what they wanted. And of course, the main task was looting in the enemy territory. We don't have an evidence of the early Benedictine monasteries being suppressed. First of all, the Longobards didn't take we don't have properly an idea of any evidence, right, of the Longobards oppressing any specific community. The Longobards were Arians, at large, and they were ruling over an overwhelming Catholic population, right, in Italy. And as we've seen, the Longobard ecclesiastical administration essentially overlapped with the Catholic one. They just substituted part of their bishops that occupied also vacancies, and that's it, right? We don't have evidence of, say, the Longobards persecuting Christians or Catholics. We have just a very complicated political game occurring between ecclesiastical hierarchies, because Constantinople was not Rome, Rome was not the Longobards, and so there was a very interesting game that brought at some point also Rome siding with the Longobards against Constantinople in ecclesiastical matters, because the Byzantines had their own issues with Eastern heterodoxy, if not heresy, to cope with, to keep the Eastern provinces under control. And actually the Longobards, in the broader history of objective primitive Christianity, were, just like Westerners in general, dramatically orthodox. They never took like a direction, like saying, now we are Arians, we're starting to develop different further theology from it. No, they had adopted very pragmatically, just to, in that way, Arianism was adopted for them. I'm not going to digress, but just like saying, hey, we are kind of acceptable as Christians now in the international game, but we're still different from you. Like, we don't want to be literally the same, because we still want to be politically autonomous. And that's it. But again, there is in Longobard history not a single evidence of, say, we destroy this place because we think it's against our religious beliefs. Maybe those Longobards that destroyed Monte Cassino were still, pagans at heart, hated Christianity and wanted to sack it together with. We don't just have any evidence of that. We don't have any political accusation in that regard, right? Also because the popes were very interested in the Longobards. And in fact, what here the author of the question refers to is in fact, the foundation of Bobbio, for example, by Saint Columbanus under Agilulf, who was still an Arian king, so it was perfectly fine saying, okay, let's let this fully Catholic missionary found a monastery in the Longobard, in the Po Valley. Agilulf was married with Theodolinda, who was actually Autharius, the first Longobard king, widow. She was Bavarian, by the way, and thus Catholic, actually, differently from the Longobards. And she also wrote with the Pope. They were very close in that regard. And they helped bringing, in this sense, this Italic world together. And the main tension, again, being war between the Byzantines and the Longobards. Not even having the Longobards' particular issues against the Pope, right? Saying the Longobards hated the Pope, they wanted to stop the spread of the Benedictine. There was none of that, right? They were Christians as far as they were concerned. They just were Arians, and they played this politically, but there is no evidence of persecutions, distractions, etc. The same goes, say, even for the Vandals. People say, the Vandals were terrible, they persecuted, but there is no evidence of any church being destroyed in Africa. I think just one may have been just accidental of the many of the hundreds of ones that existed. So the question here is, where also the stereotype emerged from? Well, of course, when the popes were siding the Byzantines in the wars against the Longobards, especially in the early period, right, in the early 7th century, things began to change. Agilulf and Theodolinda are, even before Rotary, by the way, Agilulf agreed their children to be baptized the Catholic, the Roman Rite way. So this is quite interesting, as you understand, and there is no history of the Longobards having practical issues with conversion eventually, because another misinterpretation of the story is the fact that until the second half of the 7th century, the Longobards maintained at court some parties that were called the Arians and the Catholics, and this doesn't mean that they actually meant anything theologically, because they were essentially, who were pro, let's say, yeah, there was this broader international siding. Again, do we have to be more lenient towards, you know, the papal held area where they wanted to expand or things like that, or the exarchate? What do we have to do? Those were internal mechanisms too, about which we don't understand everything. But there we see that there are people who were previously from the Arian side to switch to the Catholic one, similar things, and you understand that the obvious point was just who wanted to become king. And as we were saying before, very far from being their religious or independentistic tensions, this was just a game between the Longobard elites to say, okay, I will become the next king, or the other guy will become the next king. And there is hardly any, for example, full-scale war. If it ever happened for this throne contentions, it was from within the same north. It was always politically united. They had the same strategic interests, the same. They never, but they clashed in, say, the two clienteles. Like if that guy wanted to become king or the other, in Pavia in the palace. That's it, and it ended there. And by the end of the 7th century, the Longobards were fully Catholic. In the 8th century, they were so also friendly with the papacy at large. They were recognized as such internationally, by the way. So the bad name of the Longobards is from the sources of either the very early years of the invasion, because they went out of control from the Byzantines that probably settled them, and there was war being fought, or the very end of the Longobard history, where the popes decide that the Longobards are too pressuring on Rome, and so they called the Franks to take the Longobards out, and therefore start saying, these are terrible people, they are impious. Why? Because they attacked the church, but it had nothing to do with theology or with their beliefs. It was completely Christian, right? And Catholic specifically, especially in these areas of Europe. There was no tension of any sort in that regard. And by the way, there were also pro-Longobard factions in Rome that would have also taken over probably the same papal election. That would have seen a pro-Longobard pope had they won, and so the Franks may have probably not even been ever called. And yet, superficial people like Cantor could say, look, since this random war band destroyed Monte Cassino, so we have to think the Longobards at large were trying to destroy monasticism. And this from a person that is allegedly, somewhat close or even expert to monastic history. Are we joking? Like, these are not Western academics, standards that you can that are allowed, as far as I know, anywhere today. Like, you just cannot say these things without being mocked and laughed at for having even pronounced them. And it's terrifying, and so nobody really understands what real things are going on in whoever thought this mind, and it's just pretty sad. So I don't know what to add, frankly, to this. I just think it's pretty lame that these things were written in the first place. They do not have any adherence to historical evidence, to reality, to even basic political or social logic. And they are just like saying, let's perpetrate the stereotype that these were brutes because there is a letter that, I don't know, that survived from the Pope talking with the Byzantine Emperor while they were fighting a war that, by the way, involved the Franks against the Longobards. And let's pretend that is the actual story. that these Longobards are just a bunch of animals. It's not really the thing. By the way, I would like to point out that the Franks that were fully Catholic by name and that were even allied with the Byzantines against the Longobards in these wars are lamented to, are, say, accused to have still carried out human sacrifices in the early 7th century by Pope Gregory the Great, which is the one that, again, also joined, let's say, had relations with the Longobards, with Theodolinda, and so on. And we don't have any evidence of the Longobards carrying out human sacrifices when they were in Italy, by the way, which, say, in papal terms regarding to the Franks, they were not seen as enemies at that point, but still there was a complaint, like, these guys are Catholic, they should be the champions of the faith, and they still carry out human sacrifices. It's kind of more credible. And human sacrifices were actually carried out. Probably not in the way we've seen in movies, etc., but still, these were simply prisoners of war that were massacred ritually later. Right, so yes, they did carry out human sacrifices, but those were the Franks, and I think in the early 7th century, the Longobards were already a bit more civilized than the Franks, that frankly, in fact, in the north of Gaul didn't have surely the moral, the cultural, and the broader, political inputs for being kind of more civilized than a people that had settled in the heart of what had been the Roman Empire, and was sustained and by the local population that allowed to form such a solid institutional administrative system that went on to become hegemonic in the peninsula. So I frankly, again, don't think there is much else to add. I will keep telling, of course, Longobard history whenever I can from my topic cycle choice, let's say. But just be aware of the fact that history is known. It's much more complex than what most experts or so-called ones are aware of, and that such judgments, like the ones that were expressed here in the comment by either Cantor's doing, or just maybe a slight misinterpretation of the sources, are in that form, in that kind of presented logic, etc., the per se the indicator of their own falsity, right? Even if the same concepts had been expressed, the same concept had expressed a correct judgment, just the way they were expressed, the way they were written, if this were the actual words, but it makes them useless historically and historiographically. And having seen what was normally Cantor's prose, I wouldn't be so surprised if this was actually said or believed by the author. But at the same time, authors, and I hope this was clear in the video in itself, are much more complex, and there are interesting things that Cantor wrote in spite of this that are maybe interesting also because they are controversial, but that still should be read, known, etc. So if anyone reads my I have found terrifying things on the internet. There is literally a page which is titled, I take responsibility for what I'm saying because I find it excessive, but that may express sadly also in a dark way the irony, but not even so much so the irony of the judgment that was expressed on Cantor back in the day. There is a page that literally says, today it's November the 20th, 2022. So I don't know how much it will stay there, but I think it's very long, because I think this is before Cantor's death. Literally a topic, I think it's a forum, says, please Cantor die, or at least stop writing history, or what you think it's history, something like that. I would never wish somebody's death just because they write stupid things, unless they, of course, do it with some broader purpose of damage or evil. But let's say, I've never seen, about at least the historians that I know, somebody say, please die, right? I don't know, those person's wishes were probably, in that sense, fulfilled, because the poor Cantor passed 2004. But in general, and I wouldn't, of course, like to smear even the memory of a person who passed in such relatively recent time, but in general, we have to be honest about the fact that things we say leave a mark, and this said from a person that uploaded 1,500 videos on YouTube. So I'm also taking all my responsibility for what I say, and in part history is this, and it does get down to this, and I think it's quite relevant to discuss, even to make people aware of. In any case, as I was saying before, that comment is not going to be published. In any case, this video is, and that was all was written in it. I say that because eventually these comments get, if you don't approve them, they get cancelled after 1 month or something like that, and so at some point they disappear also for me. But I say immortalize them in this video. For now, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this one. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.